The screaming started at exactly 3:17 a.m., piercing through the humid Lagos night like a blade through silk. Adunni Okafor jolted awake in her comfortable bed, sweat already beading on her forehead as an otherworldly wail echoed from the empty lot next to her house, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. What would you do if this happened to you? Hit like if you've ever felt haunted by regret, and comment below where you're watching from. The screaming wasn't human. It couldn't be. No human throat could produce such a bone-chilling sound that made her windows rattle and her expensive imported curtains flutter without any wind. Adunni pressed her palms against her ears, but the sound seemed to burrow deeper into her skull, carrying with it whispers in a language she didn't recognize yet somehow understood. You refused, now pay the price. Her husband Emeka stirred beside her, muttering something about generator noise, but he didn't wake. How could he sleep through this? The screaming intensified, joined now by what sounded like heavy chains being dragged across concrete, metal scraping against stone in a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. Adunni crept to the window, her silk nightgown clinging to her trembling body. Through the security bars and thick glass, she peered into the darkness of the empty lot where old Mama Folek's house had stood for 30 years, until 3 months ago, when the elderly woman had begged Adunni for help, and Adunni had turned her away. The lot wasn't empty anymore. A house stood there, exactly where Mama Folek's home had been, but wrong in every possible way. Its walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs. Windows that should have been dark glowed with a sickly yellow light that hurt to look at directly. And standing in the doorway, silhouetted against that terrible glow, was the unmistakable figure of an old woman in traditional wrapper and head tie. Mama Folek. Dead for 2 months. Staring directly at Adunni's window. The figure raised one skeletal hand and pointed. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. Then came the laughter, soft, knowing, and filled with promises of retribution. Adunni stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. This couldn't be real. Grief and guilt could make you see things, couldn't they? She'd read about that somewhere. But as she watched, frozen in terror, more figures began appearing in the windows of the impossible house. Old faces, young faces, all of them people she had turned away over the years when they'd come to her door seeking help. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text message from an unknown number. You could have saved her. Now she will take everything from you. The Hollow House remembers all debts. The African horror story that was about to unfold would test every belief Adunni held about family, morality, and the supernatural punishment that comes to those who harden their hearts against their neighbors. This haunted house curse would force her to confront the betrayal and redemption that lay at the heart of her own soul. As dawn began to creep over Victoria Island, the impossible house faded like morning mist, leaving only the empty lot. But the stench of decay lingered, and written in the red dirt were words in Yoruba that made Adunni's blood run cold. 7 days. 7 chances. 7 lives. 3 months earlier, Lagos had been experiencing one of its worst rainstorms in decades. The streets of Victoria Island were flooded, and the expensive drainage systems that were supposed to protect the wealthy neighborhoods had failed spectacularly. Adunni sat in her climate-controlled living room, watching the rain pound against her reinforced windows while she sipped imported tea and reviewed her latest business contracts. The knock on her door came soft at first, barely audible over the storm. Adunni ignored it, assuming it was just the wind rattling her security gate. But it came again, more insistent this time, followed by a voice calling her name. Adunni! Please, I know you're home. I need your help. Through the intercom system, Adunni could see an elderly woman huddled under a torn umbrella, rain streaming down her weathered face. She recognized her immediately, Mama Folek from the modest house next door, the woman who had been her family's neighbor for over 15 years. Adunni's finger hovered over the gate release button. Mama Folek had never asked her for anything before, despite the obvious wealth gap between their households. The old woman sold vegetables at Balagan Market and lived simply, but with dignity. She'd always greeted Adunni with warm smiles and traditional blessings. Please, my dear. Mama Folake's voice crackled through the intercom, desperation bleeding through the static. The roof of my house collapsed in the storm. My grandchildren are with me, and we have nowhere to go. I know you have extra rooms. Just for tonight, until I can contact my son in Abuja. Adunni stared at the security monitor, watching the old woman's shoulders shake. Whether from cold or crying, she couldn't tell. Behind Mama Folake, she could make out two small children, a boy and a girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, clinging to their grandmother's wrapper. Adunni, I know you can hear me. I've seen your light on. Please, I'm not asking for money. Just shelter from the storm. The rational part of Adunni's mind began calculating risks. These people were virtual strangers, despite being neighbors. What if they stole something? What if they brought diseases into her clean home? What if they expected more help after tonight? Her husband Emeka had warned her about getting involved with the neighbors' problems. It never ended well for people like them who had worked hard to elevate their status. But it was the sound of one of the children coughing, a harsh, wet sound that spoke of illness and exposure, that made Adunni's decision for her. I'm sorry, Mama Folake, she said through the intercom, her voice carefully neutral. This really isn't a good time. Have you tried the community center on Tafawa Balewa Road? They have emergency shelter programs. The silence that followed was deafening. Adunni watched as Mama Folake's face transformed, hope crumbling into something that looked almost like recognition, as if she had expected this response but had hoped to be proven wrong. The community center is flooded too, Adunni. I wouldn't ask if I had anywhere else to go. I'm sure you'll find somewhere. Adunni replied, already moving away from the intercom. Good luck. She turned off the monitor and drew the curtains, but not before seeing Mama Folake gather the children closer and walk back into the storm. The old woman moved slowly, as if each step required tremendous effort, and Adunni noticed for the first time how thin she had become. That night, Adunni couldn't sleep. She told herself it was the storm, the way the wind howled and the rain hammered her roof. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mama Folake's face, the moment when hope died and was replaced by a deeper sadness that seemed to age her years in seconds. 2 weeks later, she learned that Mama Folake had died of pneumonia in the overcrowded government hospital. The old woman had spent 3 days in the storm-flooded streets with her grandchildren before a distant relative in Surulere had finally taken them in. But by then, the damage was done. At the funeral, which Adunni attended out of social obligation, Mama Folake's son, Babatunde, had looked directly at her during his eulogy. My mother was a woman who never refused help to anyone, he had said, his voice carrying clearly over the cemetery. She believed that in times of trouble, we are all family. She believed that those who have been blessed with more have a duty to share with those who have less. She died believing this, even after. His eyes found Adunni's in the crowd. Even after some people proved her wrong. Now, standing in her living room as the impossible house faded with the dawn, Adunni understood that some debts could never be forgiven, and some curses were earned through the simple act of closing your heart when it should have opened. The modern African folklore was beginning, and she was about to learn that supernatural punishment comes to those who forget the bonds that tie communities together. By the second night, Adunni had almost convinced herself that exhaustion and guilt had created the terrifying vision of the hollow house. She'd spent the day researching grief hallucinations on the internet and calling her doctor about sleeping pills. Emeka had noticed her jumpiness at breakfast but attributed it to work stress. He was too busy with his own banking career to probe deeper. But at exactly 3:17 a.m., the screaming started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the empty lot. It was coming from inside her house. Adunni bolted upright, her silk nightgown drenched in cold sweat despite the air conditioning. The sound was coming from downstairs, a child's scream, high and desperate, mixed with an old woman's voice calling her name. Adunni! Adunni! Why didn't you help us? Beside her, Emeka continued sleeping peacefully, as if nothing was happening. She shook him violently, but he only mumbled and turned over. It was as if the sounds existed only for her. The screaming grew louder, more insistent. Adunni could make out words now, Yoruba phrases her grandmother had taught her, prayers for mercy and forgiveness. But twisted, corrupted, turned into accusations. You let us die in the storm! You let the children suffer! Terror rooted her to the bed for several minutes, but maternal instinct finally drove her to action. Her own children, 15-year-old Kemi and 12-year-old Tund, were sleeping in their rooms down the hall. If something supernatural was in her house, she had to protect them. Grabbing her phone as a flashlight, Adunni crept out of the bedroom and down the marble staircase. The screaming seemed to follow her, echoing off the walls of her expensive home, bouncing between the imported furniture and artwork that represented years of careful financial planning. The front door was standing wide open. Ice-cold terror washed over her. She distinctly remembered activating the security system before bed. She'd done it every night for 5 years. The door shouldn't be able to open without triggering alarms that would wake the entire neighborhood. But there it was, open to the humid Lagos night, and through the doorway, she could see the impossible house again. It stood in the empty lot, solid and real, its windows glowing with that sick yellow light. And silhouetted in the doorway stood Mama Folklore, still wearing the same soaked wrapper and head tie she'd died in. You could have saved us, the figure said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. One night. That's all we needed. One night of your kindness. Other shapes moved behind Mama Folklore, the 2 grandchildren, but wrong somehow, their eyes hollow and their skin the color of storm clouds. They raised their small hands toward Adunni, and she could see through their palms, as if they were made of dirty water. Come to us, Auntie Adunni, the ghostly children said in unison. Come see what your cruelty created. Adunni slammed the doors shut and frantically worked the locks, but the screaming continued from inside the house now. It seemed to come from every room at once. The kitchen where she'd been eating imported meals while neighbors starved, the living room where she'd ignored pleas for help, the home office where she'd counted money while others suffered. Her phone rang. The same unknown number as the night before. Hello? She whispered. Day 2. Came Mama Folklore's voice through the speaker, crackling with static that sounded like dying breath. 5 days left. The hollow house grows stronger, and your family grows weaker. Your children will pay for your sins, Adunni. Just as my grandchildren paid for your hardness. The line went dead, and the screaming stopped abruptly. Upstairs, she could hear Kemi crying out in her sleep, not the ordinary sounds of dreams, but the terrified wails of a child trapped in nightmare. Adunni ran to her daughter's room to find the 15-year-old thrashing in her bed, speaking Yoruba in her sleep despite never having learned the language. Mama Folklore is coming, Kemi whispered, her eyes still closed. She's coming for all of us. The rain is coming back, and this time there's nowhere to run. The family curse had begun in earnest, and Adunni realized that the haunting wasn't just about her. It was about everyone she loved. The supernatural punishment would touch them all. The 3rd day brought no relief, only a different kind of terror. Adunni sat in her office at the bank, trying to focus on loan applications and quarterly reports, but her hands shook every time she heard footsteps in the corridor. Sleep had become impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those hollow-eyed children reaching for her. Worse, the haunting was following her beyond her home. At precisely 3:17 p.m., 12 hours after the nightly visitations, Mama Folklore's voice began whispering from the air vents in her office. Soft at first, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning, but growing clearer with each passing minute. Your children are forgetting how to breathe, Adunni. Just like mine did in the storm. Adunni's colleague, Mrs. Adunni, a woman she'd worked alongside for 7 years, knocked on her office door. Are you feeling all right? You look unwell. I'm fine, Adunni lied, but her voice came out as a croak. Just tired. Mrs. Adunni studied her with concern. You know, I heard about what happened to that old woman who used to live next to you. Mama Folklore, wasn't it? Such a tragedy. I heard she came to several houses in the neighborhood that night, looking for help during the storm. Adunni's blood turned to ice. What do you mean, several houses? My sister lives in your area. She said the old woman was going door to door, but nobody would help her. Eventually, she ended up sleeping under the bridge with those poor grandchildren. 3 days in the rain before they got sick. Mrs. Adunni shook her head sadly. You know what they say, when we refuse kindness to others, it comes back to haunt us. The words felt like a knife twisting in Adunni's chest. I didn't know she had tried other houses. Oh yes. But you know how it is with us successful people. Mrs. Adunni continued, unknowingly driving the blade deeper. We get so focused on protecting what we have that we forget our obligations to the community. That's probably why her son was so angry at the funeral. Adunni's phone buzzed with a text from Emeka. Kemi collapsed at school. At Lagos University Teaching Hospital now. Come quickly. Terror gave her wings. She drove through Lagos traffic like a madwoman, her expensive car weaving between buses and motorcycles while Mama Folake's laughter echoed from the radio no matter which station she tuned to. At the hospital, she found Emeka pacing in the waiting room, his usually immaculate banker's attire rumpled and stained with sweat. What happened? She demanded. She just fell over during chemistry class, he said, his voice hollow. Started speaking in some local language, then collapsed. The doctors can't find anything wrong with her, but she won't wake up properly. She keeps talking to someone named Mama Folake. Adunni's legs nearly gave out. Where is she? In the pediatric ward, Kemi lay in a hospital bed that reminded Adunni sickeningly of the one where Mama Folake had died. Her daughter's skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and her breathing was shallow and labored, just like pneumonia patients. Mama, Kemi whispered without opening her eyes. The old woman says you have to come to the Hollow House. She says it's the only way to save us. The duty nurse, a middle-aged Yoruba woman with kind eyes, pulled Adunni aside. Your daughter keeps asking for forgiveness from someone who isn't here. She says she's drowning but there's no water. Have you considered spiritual causes? Spiritual causes? Sometimes, when someone dies with a heavy heart, their spirit doesn't rest. Especially if they died feeling abandoned by their community. The old people say these spirits can affect the living, particularly the children of those who wronged them. The nurse's words confirmed what Adunni already knew but refused to accept. This wasn't medical, it was supernatural punishment for her betrayal and cruelty. The modern African folklore her grandmother had told her was real, and she was living it. That night, as she sat beside Kemi's hospital bed, Adunni's phone rang again. Day 3. Mama Folake's voice whispered through the speaker. Your daughter tastes water in her lungs now, just like my grandchildren did. 4 days left, Adunni. 4 chances to make this right. But the longer you wait, the deeper the Hollow House grows. The line went dead, and Kemi began coughing, wet, horrible sounds that brought up nothing but seemed to be drowning her from the inside. Redemption seemed impossible, but Adunni was beginning to understand that it might be the only way to save her family from the curse she had brought upon them all. The 4th day dawned gray and oppressive over Lagos, matching Adunni's internal despair. Kemi remained in the hospital, her condition stable but unchanged, still speaking to invisible spirits, still coughing up phantom water, still gray as the storm clouds that had taken Mama Folake's life. Adunni hadn't slept in 36 hours. Every time she closed her eyes, the Hollow House appeared behind her lids, growing larger and more solid. She could feel it pulling at her, demanding payment for the debt of cruelty she had incurred. But it was Tun's scream from the breakfast table that finally broke her resolve to handle this alone. Mama! Her 12-year-old son wailed, staring at his bowl of cereal. There are worms in my food! Black worms everywhere! Adunni rushed to the dining room to find Tun backing away from the table in terror, pointing at a bowl that appeared perfectly normal to her eyes. But his young face was twisted with genuine horror, tears streaming down his cheeks. I can see them moving, he sobbed. They're trying to crawl into my mouth like they did to the other children. The ones who died in the rain. Emeka, who had been reading the morning paper, looked up in confusion. What's wrong with you people? It's just cornflakes. But Adunni understood. The curse was spreading to Tun now, showing him visions of decay and death. Just like Kemi's phantom drowning, Her son was experiencing the supernatural punishment meant for her. "We need help," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "Help from who?" Emeka demanded, finally setting down his paper. "Adunni, you've been acting strange for days. First, all this nonsense about screaming in the night, then Kemi's mysterious illness, and now Tund is hallucinating. What's really going on?" For the first time in their 15-year marriage, Adunni told her husband everything. About refusing Mama Folake's plea for help. About the old woman's death from exposure and pneumonia. About the hollow house that appeared each night at 3:17 a.m. About the phone calls from the dead and the supernatural retribution that was claiming their children. Emeka listened in stunned silence, his rational banker's mind struggling to process what sounded like the ravings of someone having a complete breakdown. "You're talking about ghosts, Adunni. Dead people making phone calls. Houses that appear and disappear. This isn't real." "Then explain our children," she snapped, desperation making her voice sharp. "Explain why Kemi speaks perfect Yoruba in her sleep when she's never learned it. Explain why Tun sees decay where there should be food. Explain why this started exactly 3 days after I first saw the hollow house." Before Emeka could respond, both their phones chimed simultaneously with text messages. The same unknown number, the same message. Day 4. "Come to the hollow house tonight. Come alone. Your family's suffering ends only when you accept responsibility for what you've done." Emeka stared at his phone in shock. "How is this possible? How did someone get both our numbers? How do they know about our private conversation?" "Because it's not someone, Emeka. It's something. And it won't stop until I make this right." That afternoon, while Emeka stayed at the hospital with Kemi, Adunni drove to Balogun Market where Mama Folake had sold vegetables for 20 years. She needed to understand more about the woman she had condemned to death through her refusal to show basic human kindness. The other market women remembered Mama Folake with obvious affection and deep sorrow. "She was the kind of person who would give you her last naira if you needed it," said Mama Yatund, an elderly pepper seller who had worked beside Folake for 15 years. "When my husband died, she brought food to my house for a month. When young Chioma's baby was sick, Mama Folake paid the hospital bills even though she barely had enough for herself." "But she had family," Adunni protested. "Her son in Abuja." Mama Yatund shook her head sadly. "Babatunde is a good boy, but he's struggling too. 3 children of his own, and a wife who's been sick. He sent what he could, but it was never enough. That's why Mama Folake still came to the market every day at her age. Those grandchildren were depending on her." Each detail felt like another weight on Adunni's conscience. Mama Folake hadn't been some stranger seeking charity, she had been a pillar of her community, a woman who had given freely to others her entire life. And in her moment of greatest need, when the storm had destroyed her home and endangered her grandchildren, the one neighbor with the resources to help had turned her away. "Did she?" Adunni swallowed hard. "Did she talk about that night? The night she died?" The market women exchanged meaningful glances. Finally, Mama Yatund spoke. "She told us about going to the big houses in Victoria Island. How the rich people wouldn't even open their gates to speak to her properly. But there was one house where she stood in the rain for 20 minutes, begging through the intercom. The woman inside could have helped but chose not to. Mama Folake said she could see the lights on, could hear the television playing. But the woman told her to go to the community center, knowing it was flooded." Adunni closed her eyes, shame burning through her like acid. "She died cursing that house," Mama Yatund continued quietly. "Died saying that some people are blessed not for their own sake, but to be a blessing to others. And when they forget that, their blessings become curses." As night fell over Lagos, Adunni sat in her car outside her house, staring at the empty lot where the hollow house would soon appear. She understood now that this wasn't just about supernatural punishment, it was about a community that had failed one of its most generous members. And the betrayal and redemption that needed to happen wasn't just spiritual, it was deeply human. At exactly 3:17 a.m., she would have to face what she had done. The modern African folklore demanded it, and her family's lives hung in the balance. The fifth night arrived with an ominous stillness that seemed to press down on Lagos like a heavy blanket. Even the usual sounds of the city, generators humming, night birds calling, distant traffic, seemed muffled and far away. Adunni sat in her living room, watching the clock creep toward 3:17 a.m., knowing that tonight she would have to confront the Hollow House directly. Kemi's condition had worsened. The doctors were baffled by her symptoms. Her lungs showed signs of fluid that wasn't there. Her blood work suggested drowning while she lay in a hospital bed. Tund had stopped eating entirely, claiming that everything turned to mud and worms in his mouth. Emeka, practical banker that he was, had finally begun to accept that something beyond medical explanation was happening to their family. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told her as midnight approached. "About debts and curses and moral consequences. My grandfather used to tell stories like this when I was young. Before I got educated and stopped believing in such things." "What kind of stories?" "About people who forgot their obligations to the community. How the ancestors would punish them through their children until they made amends. He said the spirits of the wronged dead could bind themselves to the living world through unfinished business." Emeka took her hand, his own trembling slightly. I think maybe we were taught to dismiss these beliefs, but that doesn't make them less real." At 3:15 a.m., Adunni kissed her husband goodbye and walked out into the humid Lagos night. The security lights in her compound seemed dimmer than usual, and the air itself felt thick with anticipation. At exactly 3:17, the Hollow House materialized in the empty lot like a nightmare becoming reality. But tonight it was different. Larger. More solid. More terrifyingly real. The sickly yellow light from its windows cast long shadows across the ground, and Adunni could see figures moving inside, not just Mama Folake and her grandchildren, but others. A crowd of people she slowly began to recognize. The homeless man she'd driven past every day for 2 years without ever stopping to offer food or work. The young mother who had begged for help with her sick baby outside the bank, whom Adunni had reported to security for loitering. The old man who collected bottles from her neighborhood trash, whom she'd called the authorities to remove because he lowered property values. All the people she had failed over the years. All the small cruelties and willful blindnesses that had built up into this moment of supernatural reckoning. Mama Folake stood in the doorway, no longer the desperate, rain-soaked figure from that terrible night. Now she appeared as she had in life, dignified, wearing her best wrapper and head tie, her eyes kind but infinitely sad. "You came," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. "I wasn't sure you would find the courage. I've come to make things right," Adunni called back, her voice shaking but determined. "Please. My children are innocent. They don't deserve to suffer for my mistakes." "Innocent?" Mama Folake's expression hardened. "Were my grandchildren not innocent when they shivered in the rain for 3 days? Was little Say not innocent when the fever took her because no one would help us get to the hospital in time?" Behind Mama Folake, the ghostly figures of the 2 children stepped forward. In the sickly light, Adunni could see them clearly now, beautiful children, perhaps 6 and 8 years old, with eyes that held too much knowledge of suffering. "We asked you for help, Auntie," the little girl said, her voice carrying the weight of accusation. "We were cold and scared, and you had warm beds upstairs. You had food in your kitchen. You had medicine in your cabinets. But you chose to let us die. I didn't know you would die," Adunni protested, tears streaming down her face. "I was afraid, I was selfish, I was wrong, but I never wanted anyone to die. Intent doesn't matter to the dead," Mama Folake replied. "Results matter. Consequences matter. The choice you made in that moment of comfort and safety condemned 3 people to death. That kind of debt must be paid." "Then let me pay it," Adunni cried. "Take me instead of my children. I'm the one who failed you. I'm the one who deserves punishment." The Hollow House seemed to pulse with consideration, its breathing walls expanding and contracting as if alive. The yellow light in the windows flickered, and for a moment, Adunni thought she heard whispered conversations in languages both familiar and strange. "There is a way," Mama Folake said finally. "But it requires more than words, Adunni. More than guilt and regret. It requires action. Change. A true transformation of the heart that closed itself to us." "Anything," Adunni whispered. "Tell me what to do." 7 acts of true kindness, given freely and without expectation of reward. 7 chances to prove that you have learned what it means to be truly human. But you must begin tonight, and you must complete them before the 7th dawn, or your children will join us in the Hollow House forever. The supernatural punishment was offering her a path to redemption, but Adunni understood that it would require her to become someone entirely different from the person she had been. The curse would only lift when the betrayal was fully acknowledged and the heart that had closed itself to compassion was opened again. As the Hollow House began to fade with the approaching dawn, Mama Folake's voice drifted across the distance one final time. "Remember, Adunni, kindness delayed is kindness denied. And some debts can only be paid with the coin of genuine love." Dawn broke over Lagos with unusual clarity, as if the city itself was holding its breath to see whether Adunni would succeed in breaking the curse. She had 2 days left, 7 acts of kindness to perform, and no guarantee that anything she did would be enough to satisfy the spirits of the Hollow House. Her first act began immediately. At 6 a.m., she drove to the bridge where Mama Folake and her grandchildren had sheltered during the storm. The area was notorious for its homeless population, people that the wealthy residents of Victoria Island typically ignored or actively avoided. But now, Adunni saw them with new eyes. She stopped at a 24-hour supermarket and filled her car with food, blankets, and basic medical supplies. Then she returned to the bridge and began distributing them personally, not through a charity organization or paid staff, but with her own hands. The first person she approached was an elderly man with cataracts, sitting on a piece of cardboard and shivering in the morning chill. "Good morning, sir," she said respectfully, offering him a warm blanket and a bag of food. "I brought breakfast for you." The old man looked up at her suspiciously. "Why? What do you want?" "Nothing," Adunni replied, and realized it was the first completely honest thing she'd said in years. "I just want to help." As she worked her way through the community under the bridge, giving blankets to mothers with babies, food to unemployed laborers, medicine to those with obvious ailments, she began to understand something that had eluded her for decades. These weren't faceless problems to be solved by government or charity organizations. These were individuals with stories, families, dreams that had been derailed by circumstances that could befall anyone. A young woman with a sick toddler reminded her of herself when Kemi had been small. An old man trying to keep his dignity while accepting help reminded her of her own grandfather. Each person she served taught her something about the community bonds she had severed through years of willful blindness. By noon, word of her presence had spread through the area's informal networks. People began approaching her, not begging, but simply acknowledging her presence with the quiet dignity that she was learning to recognize. She had never realized how visible she had made herself in her efforts to remain separate from the community's struggles. Her second act of kindness came when she encountered a pregnant teenager who had been living rough for weeks after being thrown out by her family. Instead of just giving her food and money, Adunni took her to a private clinic, paid for her prenatal care, and arranged temporary housing with a church organization. "Why are you doing this for me?" the girl asked as they sat in the clinic waiting room. "You don't even know my name." "My name is Adunni," she replied. "What's yours?" "Blessing." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Here was Adunni, finally learning to be a blessing to others, helping a girl named Blessing who had been discarded by those who should have protected her. "I'm helping you because I should have been helping people all along," Adunni said simply. "I forgot that we're all connected. Your suffering is my suffering. Your joy should be my joy." That afternoon, her third act involved visiting the construction site near her office where day laborers waited for work. She'd passed these men every morning for 5 years, never acknowledging them, never considering their humanity. Now she stopped and listened to their stories. She learned about Rashidi, whose family in Kaduna depended on the money he sent home from whatever work he could find in Lagos. About Ibrahim, who had a degree in engineering but couldn't find formal employment without connections. About Joseph, who supported his elderly mother and 3 orphan nieces on the irregular income from construction jobs. Without hesitation, Adunni hired all 3 men to do renovation work on her house, work that didn't really need doing, but which would provide them with steady income for several weeks. More importantly, she treated them as skilled professionals deserving of respect, not as charity cases. "Madam, why are you being so kind to us?" Rashidi asked as they discussed the job details. "Usually, people like you don't even see people like us." "I'm learning to see," Adunni replied. "And I'm learning that people like you and people like me is a lie I told myself to avoid responsibility." Her 4th act came that evening when she visited Kemi in the hospital. Her daughter's condition remained unchanged, still gray, still coughing up phantom water, still speaking to the dead in her sleep. But Adunni noticed the other children in the pediatric ward, and their families. She saw mothers sleeping in chairs beside their children's beds because they couldn't afford to go home and return the next day. Fathers standing in hallways making desperate phone calls, trying to arrange money for treatments their insurance wouldn't cover. Children suffering not just from illness, but from the fear and helplessness they saw in their parents' eyes. Quietly, Adunni began paying for things. A mother's transportation home to shower and change clothes. A family's unpaid hospital bills that were preventing their child's discharge. Medicine that was prescribed but unaffordable. She moved through the ward like an angel of mercy, asking for nothing in return, expecting no gratitude, simply responding to need with resources. The night nurse, the same Yoruba woman who had spoken to her about spiritual causes, watched her work with knowing eyes. "You're trying to balance the scales," she observed as Adunni paid for a young boy's surgery. "I'm trying to save my children," Adunni replied. "Same thing," the nurse said quietly. "In the old ways, individual salvation and community healing are the same process. You cannot be well while your neighbors suffer. You cannot be blessed while you ignore the cursed." That night, as 3:17 a.m. approached, Adunni felt a change in the spiritual atmosphere around her house. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on her family for days seemed lighter, though not gone. When the hollow house appeared, it seemed smaller somehow, less solid. Mama Folake stood in the doorway as before, but now she was not alone. The 3 men she had hired, the pregnant girls she had helped, the families at the hospital, all of them stood behind her in spirit form, not as accusers, but as witnesses to her transformation. "4 acts completed," Mama Folake said, and for the first time, her voice held a note of something that might have been approval. 3 remain. But beware, Adunni, the hardest tests are yet to come. True kindness is easy when you choose the recipients. Tomorrow, you must show mercy to those you would prefer to hate. The hollow house faded with the dawn, but Adunni understood that her journey toward redemption was far from over. The supernatural punishment was demanding not just good deeds, but a complete transformation of her character, including the parts of herself she liked least. The 6th day brought Adunni face to face with the hardest truth of all, that some acts of kindness require forgiving those who have wronged you, and some require helping those you have every reason to despise. Her 5th act of kindness came in the form of a phone call she never wanted to make. "Hello, Mrs. Adebayo," she said when the voice answered, her hands trembling as she held the phone. "This is Adunni Okafor. I'm calling about your son, Colonel." Mrs. Adebayo's sharp intake of breath was audible across the connection. Colonel Adebayo was the man who had embezzled nearly 2 million naira from the bank where Adunni worked, money that had belonged to small business owners and struggling families. His theft had been discovered 6 months ago, and he was currently awaiting trial. Adunni had been one of the primary witnesses who would testify against him. "What do you want with my family?" Mrs. Adebayo asked, her voice heavy with fear and shame. "Haven't you people done enough to us?" "I want to help," Adunni said simply. "I know Colonel has 3 young children and that his wife, Grace, is struggling to feed them while he's in custody. I know they've been evicted from their apartment and are staying with relatives. I want to pay for proper housing for them and ensure the children can continue their education. The silence that followed was so long that Adunni wondered if the call had dropped. Why? Mrs. Adebayo finally whispered. My son stole from your bank. He stole from people you're supposed to protect. Why would you help his family? Because his children didn't steal anything, Adunni replied. Because Grace didn't steal anything. Because punishment should fall on the guilty, not the innocent. And because... She paused, struggling with the hardest truth. Because I've learned that withholding help when you have the power to give it is its own kind of theft. That afternoon, Adunni drove to the cramped apartment in Surlir where Kunnal's family was staying with his elderly parents. The neighborhood was a far cry from Victoria Island, narrow streets, crowded buildings, the constant noise and bustle of people living too close together with too few resources. Grace Adebayo was a thin, tired-looking woman in her early 30s, clearly worn down by months of stress and social disgrace. When she opened the door and saw Adunni, her face went pale. Please, she said immediately. We don't have the money yet. My husband's lawyer says the trial. I'm not here about restitution. Adunni interrupted gently. I'm here to help. May I come in? What followed was one of the most difficult conversations of Adunni's life. Sitting in the small living room, surrounded by Kunnal's children, ages 5, 7, and 9, she had to look past her anger at their father's betrayal and see their simple human need. I know this is strange, she told Grace, but I want to help your family get back on your feet. Not because your husband deserves it, but because you and the children deserve a chance at a normal life. Grace stared at her with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. What do you want in return? Nothing, Adunni said, and realized she was becoming more comfortable with that word. Well, that's not entirely true. I want you to let me pay for an apartment for you and the children. I want to ensure they can stay in school. I want to help you find work so you can support yourself with dignity. But why? Grace's voice broke. After what Kunnal did to your bank, to those people. Because I've learned that we're all connected, Adunni replied. Your children's futures are connected to my children's futures. When we let families fall apart because of one person's mistakes, we weaken the whole community. Her sixth act of kindness was even more challenging. That evening, she drove to the Lagos State High Court detention facility where Kunnal Adebayo was being held pending trial. She had never visited a prison before, and the experience was humbling. The long lines of family members waiting to see their loved ones, the security procedures that stripped away dignity, the overwhelming sense of human desperation that permeated the place. Kunnal was a slight man in his mid-30s, his face gaunt from months of prison food and stress. When he was brought to the visiting room and saw Adunni, he seemed to shrink into himself with shame. Mrs. Okafor, he said quietly, unable to meet her eyes. I know what you must think of me. What I think doesn't matter, Adunni replied. What matters is that you have children who love you and a wife who needs you. What matters is that when you get out of here, you have something to build toward instead of just regret to live with. She told him about the arrangements she was making for his family, about the apartment and the children's school fees and Grace's job prospects. She watched as tears began streaming down his face, not tears of relief, but tears of someone confronting the magnitude of grace he didn't deserve. Why? He whispered, echoing his wife's question. I stole from innocent people. I betrayed trust. I deserve whatever happens to me. You're right, Adunni said simply. You do deserve whatever legal punishment you receive. But your children deserve better than having their lives destroyed because of your choices. And your wife deserves the chance to rebuild. She paused, thinking about Mama Folake, about the choices that had led to this moment of reckoning. I've learned that sometimes the people who least deserve kindness are the ones who most need it to become better. I can't undo what you did, Kunnal. But I can help ensure that your family doesn't pay the price for your mistakes for the rest of their lives. As she prepared to leave, Kunnal looked up at her with something like wonder in his eyes. Mrs. Okafor, I don't understand you. But I promise you this, when I get out, I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends. Not just to the bank, but to everyone I hurt. I'll work every day to become the man my family deserves. That night, as Adunni waited for 3:17 a.m., she felt the spiritual atmosphere around her house shift again. The oppressive darkness that had suffocated her family for days was lifting, replaced by something that felt almost like anticipation. When the hollow house appeared, it was translucent now, more like a memory than a solid structure. Mama Folake stood in the doorway, but she was not alone. The spirits of everyone Adunni had helped over the past 2 days stood with her, creating a circle of witnesses to her transformation. 6 acts completed, Mama Folake said, and now her voice held definite warmth. You have shown kindness to the deserving and mercy to the guilty. You have opened your heart to those you would normally ignore and your hand to those who have wronged you. What act remains, Adunni? The hardest of all. What is it? Adunni asked, though part of her already knew. You must forgive yourself, Mama Folake replied. You must accept that the woman who turned me away in the storm is not the woman you are becoming. You must choose to believe that redemption is possible, even for those who have caused great harm. The hollow house began to fade, but Mama Folake's final words drifted across the distance. Tomorrow night you must come inside the house, Adunni. You must face what you have done, accept what you have become, and choose what you will be. Only then will the curse be broken. As dawn broke over Lagos, Adunni understood that her final test would be the most difficult of all, learning to show herself the same mercy she had begun showing others. The 7th and final day arrived with a sense of inevitability that seemed to pulse through Lagos itself. The city's usual chaos, traffic, noise, the endless hustle of millions trying to survive, felt distant and muffled, as if the entire world was holding its breath for Adunni's final test. Kemi had opened her eyes that morning for the first time in 4 days. Her skin was no longer gray, and the phantom water in her lungs seemed to be receding. Tund had eaten breakfast without seeing worms, though he remained pale and frightened. The curse was weakening, but Adunni knew it hadn't been broken yet. Her 7th act of kindness, Mama Folake had said, was to forgive herself. But how do you perform self-forgiveness as an act that saves others? How do you turn mercy inward when everything you've learned about kindness has been about serving those around you? The answer came to her as she sat in her car outside Mama Folake's son's house in Surler. She had been avoiding this visit for 6 days, but she understood now that it was necessary, not for Babatunde's forgiveness, which she had no right to expect, but for her own acceptance of what she had done and who she was becoming. Babatunde Adegbala was a man in his 40s, with his mother's kind eyes and his father's strong jaw. He worked as a teacher at a local secondary school, and Adunni found him in his small front yard, helping his own children with their homework under the shade of a mango tree. When he saw her approaching, his expression hardened, but he didn't send her away. Mrs. Okafor, he said, his voice carefully neutral. I wondered when you would come. I'm sorry, Adunni began, but he held up a hand to stop her. Before you say anything, he said, let me ask you something. Do you know what my mother was doing the day before she came to your house? Adunni shook her head, afraid of what she was about to learn. She was at the market, as usual. But she spent her last 10 naira, the money she needed for her own supper, to buy medicine for a stranger's sick child. A young woman she had never met, whose baby was crying with fever. My mother gave away her own sustenance to help someone else's child get well. Each word felt like a physical blow. I didn't know. That night, when the storm came and her roof collapsed, she was weak from hunger because she had chosen to feed others instead of herself. When she came to your house, she was already running a fever, already fighting illness. But she put her grandchildren first, as she always did. Babatunde's children had stopped their homework and were listening now, sensing the gravity of the adult conversation happening around them. She told me about your house, he continued. About the lights she could see inside, the sound of the television, the warmth she knew existed just beyond your gate. She told me she stood in the rain for 20 minutes, hoping you would change your mind. Hoping the kindness she had shown others her whole life would be reflected back to her in her moment of need. I was afraid, Adunni whispered, tears streaming down her face. I was selfish and afraid, and I made a terrible choice. I killed your mother through my cowardice. Yes, Babatunde said simply. You did. The words hung in the air between them like a judgment. But then, unexpectedly, he continued. But that's not the end of the story, is it? My neighbors have been telling me about what you've been doing this week. About the families you've helped, the money you've spent, the way you've been moving through our community like someone trying to heal every wound she can find. Adunni looked up, surprised by the lack of hatred in his voice. My mother believed that people could change, Babatunde said. She believed that even those who cause great harm can become sources of great healing, if they choose to. I think she would have been proud to know that her death led to your transformation. How can you forgive me? Adunni asked. How can you not hate me for what I took from you? Because hate is a poison that destroys the vessel that contains it, he replied. Because my mother taught me that our purpose on earth is to help each other become better people. You have become someone different in these past days. The woman who turned my mother away is not the same woman sitting in front of me now. He looked at his children, then back at Adunni. My mother's legacy isn't her death, Mrs. Okafor. It's the kindness she showed throughout her life, and the kindness her death has awakened in you. If you continue on this path, if you keep helping others, keep opening your heart to those in need, then her life and her death will have meant something. I will, Adunni promised. I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the person your mother was. I will try to be worthy of the mercy you're showing me. As she prepared to leave, Babatunde called out to her one final time. Mrs. Okafor? My mother had a saying, the heart that learns to give becomes the heart that learns to live. I think you're finally learning to live. That evening, as the sun set over Lagos, Adunni sat with her family for the first time in a week. Kemi was alert and talking, though still weak. Tund was eating normally, though he stayed close to his parents. Emeka was quiet, processing everything that had happened, everything he had witnessed. Are you different now, Mama? Kemi asked as they shared a simple dinner together. You feel different. Like warmer. I think I am different, Adunni replied honestly. I think I'm becoming the person I was always meant to be. As 3:17 a.m. approached, Adunni walked out to her front gate one final time. The hollow house materialized as it had for 6 nights, but now it appeared solid and real, almost welcoming. Warm light spilled from its windows, not the sickly yellow glow of previous nights, but the golden light of home and hearth. Mama Folake stood in the doorway, no longer wearing the rain-soaked clothes of her death, but the beautiful traditional dress she had worn to church on Sundays. She was smiling now, and behind her, Adunni could see her grandchildren, healthy, happy, at peace. Come inside, Adunni, Mama Folake said gently. It's time for the final test. It's time for you to forgive yourself and choose the life you want to live. With steady steps, Adunni walked toward the hollow house, ready to face whatever final challenge awaited her, knowing that redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to change. As Adunni crossed the threshold of the hollow house, she expected to feel terror, cold, the presence of death and accusation. Instead, she was enveloped by warmth, not physical warmth, but the spiritual warmth of forgiveness, understanding, and profound love. The interior of the house was nothing like she had imagined. Instead of the decay and horror she expected, she found herself in a room that felt like the heart of every African home she had ever known. Comfortable furniture arranged for conversation, family photographs on the walls, the lingering scent of good cooking, and the intangible atmosphere of a place where people had been truly happy. Mama Folake sat in a wooden chair that looked exactly like one Adunni's own grandmother had owned, her hands folded peacefully in her lap. The 2 grandchildren played quietly in the corner with wooden toys, their laughter bright and innocent. Around the edges of the room, other figures sat or stood, all the people Adunni had helped over the past week, all the people she had failed over the years, all watching her with expressions of compassionate attention. Sit down, my daughter, Mama Folake said gently, gesturing to a chair across from her. We need to talk. Adunni sat, her hands trembling not with fear now, but with overwhelming emotion. I don't understand. I thought this place was meant to torment me. This place is what you made it, Mama Folklore replied. When your heart was closed, when you refused compassion, this house reflected that darkness back to you. But as your heart opened, as you learned to show mercy, the house transformed. It became what it always could have been, a place of healing and understanding. She leaned forward, her eyes kind but serious. The curse was never about punishment, Adunni. It was about awakening. Some hearts can only be opened through crisis. Some people only learn to live when they are confronted with death. Some souls only find their purpose when they are forced to face what they have become. I let you die, Adunni said, the words torn from her throat. I had the power to save you, and I chose not to. How can that ever be forgiven? Because forgiveness is not about what the wrongdoer deserves, Mama Folklore replied. It is about what the forgiver chooses to release. I forgive you, Adunni, not because your action was forgivable, but because holding on to anger would prevent both of us from moving forward. She stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the Lagos skyline that was visible beyond. Do you know what I saw during those 3 days in the rain? She asked. I saw people hurrying past us with umbrellas, afraid to get wet. I saw car windows rolling up when we approached. I saw gate after gate closing against us. But I also saw a young man share his last piece of bread with us. I saw a woman give us her child's jacket. I saw humanity at its worst and its best, often within the same hour. She turned back to Adunni. The night I died, I was not thinking about you with hatred. I was thinking about my grandchildren, and hoping that somehow, my death would not be meaningless. I was hoping that the people who had closed their hearts might someday learn to open them again. I died praying for you, Adunni. The words broke something deep inside Adunni's chest. You were praying for me? Even after what I did? Especially after what you did? Because I recognized the fear in your voice when you spoke through that intercom. I recognized the voice of someone who had forgotten how to be human, how to be part of a community. I knew that kind of isolation is its own form of suffering. Mama Folklore returned to her chair and took Adunni's hands in her own. Her touch was real, warm, comforting. The seventh act of kindness, forgiving yourself, is the hardest because it requires you to accept that you are worthy of the same mercy you have learned to show others. It requires you to believe that transformation is possible, that people can change, that even those who cause great harm can become sources of great healing. I don't know how, Adunni whispered. I don't know how to stop hating what I did. You don't stop remembering what you did, Mama Folklore corrected gently. You use the memory as fuel for the person you're becoming. Every time you help someone, you honor those you failed to help. Every time you show mercy, you transform your past cruelty into present compassion. Every time you open your heart, you prove that change is possible. She squeezed Adunni's hands. The question now is, what will you do with the rest of your life? Will you carry the guilt of my death as a burden that weighs you down? Or will you carry the memory of my life as an inspiration that lifts you up? Around the room, the other spirits nodded in agreement. The homeless man from the bridge, the pregnant teenager, the families at the hospital, even those she had helped before this week, all of them looking at her with expressions of encouragement and hope. I want to live like you did, Adunni said finally. I want to be the kind of person who gives her last naira to help a stranger's child. I want to be someone who sees need and responds with love instead of fear. Then that is who you will become, Mama Folklore said with certainty. Not perfectly, not immediately, but genuinely. And every time you fail, because you will sometimes fail, we all do, you will remember this moment and choose again to be better. The house began to fill with light, not the sickly glow Adunni had seen from outside, but the warm, golden light of sunrise. Through the windows, she could see Lagos awakening to a new day. It's time for you to go back to your family, Mama Folklore said, standing. They need you, and you have work to do. Will I see you again? Adunni asked. Every time you help someone who cannot help themselves, you will see me, Mama Folklore replied. Every time you choose compassion over comfort, you will feel my presence. Every time you remember that we are all connected, all responsible for each other's well-being, you will know that my death accomplished its purpose. As Adunni reached the doorway, Mama Folklore called out one final time. Adunni? The hollow house was never cursed. It was waiting. Waiting for someone to fill it with the love and community it was meant to hold. You have done that now. You have turned a place of haunting into a place of healing. Adunni stepped out of the house and immediately felt the humid Lagos air on her skin, heard the familiar sounds of the city waking up around her. When she turned back, the hollow house was gone, not faded, but transformed. In its place stood a beautiful garden, filled with flowering plants and fruit trees, a place of life and growth and abundance. She understood that this was her future, to transform hollow places into gardens, to fill empty spaces with love, to be a blessing in a world that desperately needed more people willing to choose compassion over fear. As she walked back to her own house, where her family waited and her real life was about to begin, Adunni felt something she had never experienced before, the deep, abiding peace that comes to those who finally understand their purpose. The curse was broken, but more than that, the blessing had begun. 6 months later, the Adunni Folklore Foundation had helped over 200 families in Lagos find housing, healthcare, education, and hope. The foundation's motto, printed on every piece of literature, came from something Mama Folklore had said during their final conversation. We are all connected, all responsible for each other's well-being. The modern African folklore had taught its lesson, and the lesson would ripple outward through generations, proving that even the darkest supernatural punishment can become the brightest path to redemption. Thank you for joining us for this incredible journey of betrayal and redemption. Like this video if you believe in the power of second chances, subscribe for more African horror stories that touch the heart, and comment below what hollow places in your own life are waiting to be transformed into gardens. Your story might be featured in our next tale. Remember, kindness is never wasted, mercy is never meaningless, and it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be.